The banging on the door did not sound like a knock. It sounded like a warning. I remember thinking, in that first half-second, that it might be a storm hitting the shutters. We lived on a quiet street, where nothing ever happened after dark. Neighbors waved from their porches during the day. Dogs barked at nothing more dangerous than a passing cat. It was the kind of street where people believed bad things happened somewhere else, to other families, in other cities. I had believed that too, right up until the sound came a second time, harder and more certain, and I understood that no storm knocks with that kind of purpose. I was still in my work clothes, halfway through making tea, when the sound tore through our small house and made my hands shake. My father, Gerald Whitmore, went pale before he even reached the door. That told me everything. He knew who it was before he saw a single face. 4 men walked in without being invited. They moved like they owned the floor beneath their boots. Behind them came a 5th man, and the moment he stepped inside, the air in the room changed. He was not loud. He did not need to be. He wore a dark coat that fit him too well, and his eyes moved across our living room like he was already deciding what to take. "Gerald," the man said, calm as a held breath. "You have been avoiding my calls." My father's voice cracked. "Adrian, please, I only need a little more time." So this was Adrian Cross. I had heard the name whispered in the market, in the hallways of the bank where I used to work, in conversations that stopped the moment I walked into a room. People said his name the way they said the names of storms, with respect and fear tangled together. "Time is not something I sell anymore," Adrian said. "You have had 2 years of time." I stepped between my father and the men before I could think better of it. "What is going on? What does he owe you?" Adrian looked at me for the first time. His gaze was not cruel, but it was not kind either. It was measuring, like he was reading a contract written across my face. "Your father borrowed a large amount of money 4 years ago," Adrian said. "He used it to save this house after your mother's illness. He promised to repay it. He has repaid almost nothing." My chest tightened. I remembered those months, my mother in the hospital bed, my father disappearing for hours and coming back with cash and no explanation. I had asked him where the money came from. He always said not to worry. "How much?" I asked. Adrian said a number that made the room tilt around me. It was more than our house was worth, more than my father would earn in the rest of his life. "I do not have that," my father said, his voice breaking apart. "I will never have that." "I know," Adrian said simply. "Which is why I am not here to collect money tonight." He turned to me again, and this time his eyes stayed there. "I am here to collect something else." My father understood before I did. He lunged forward, grabbing at Adrian's coat, begging in a voice I had never heard him use. "Not her. Take the house. Take everything I own. Not my daughter." One of the men behind Adrian moved to pull my father back, but Adrian raised a hand, and the man stopped instantly. Adrian did not touch my father. He did not need to. "I already have the house," Adrian said. "I already have everything you own. There is only one thing left that has any value." He looked at me like I was a line item on a page. "Elena," he said, and the sound of my own name in his mouth felt like a door closing. "You are coming with me. Your father's debt stops growing the moment you do. That is the offer. It does not repeat." "I am not a payment," I said, and I was surprised my voice did not shake. "I am not something you can buy." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before I could name it. "No," he agreed. "You are not for sale. But your father sold something when he signed my contract, and I intend to collect what was promised." I looked at my father, hoping he would fight harder, hoping he would find some way to undo this. Instead, he sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. That was when I understood how deep this went. He was not fighting because he had already lost, months ago, maybe years ago, and had simply never told me. "If I refuse?" I asked. "Then the debt returns to its full weight, with interest that has been waiting patiently to grow again," Adrian said. "Your father loses this house within the week, and I promise you, the people who come to collect after that will not be as polite as I am being right now." I did not know if that was true, but looking at the men standing silently behind him, arms crossed, faces blank, I believed it enough. "How long?" I asked. How long do I belong to you? You do not belong to anyone, Adrian said, and there was an edge in his voice now, like the question offended him more than it should have. You will stay in my house until I decide the debt is settled. You will follow the rules of that house. In return, your father keeps this one, and keeps his life uninterrupted by people far less patient than me. I felt the walls of the small living room pressing in, the tea growing cold on the counter, the life I had built collapsing into something unrecognizable in the space of 10 minutes. I thought about the years I had spent working at the bank, saving carefully, planning a future that suddenly seemed like it belonged to a stranger. I thought about the small things, the chipped mug I liked to drink from, the garden my mother had planted before she got sick, the quiet mornings I would never again take for granted. None of it mattered to the men standing in my living room. None of it would matter to Adrian Cross either, I suspected, because men like him did not deal in mugs or gardens or mornings. They dealt in numbers, and I had just become one. I studied his face again, searching for some crack in the calm, some sign that this was difficult for him too. I found nothing. He stood with his hands folded in front of him, patient as a man waiting for a train he already knew would arrive on time. It made me angrier than any shout could have. At least shouting would have meant he felt something. Elena, do not do this, my father whispered. I will find another way. There is no other way, I said, and for the first time in my life, I heard myself sound older than him. There never was there? You just never told me how bad it had gotten. He did not answer. He did not need to. I turned to Adrian. Up close, he was younger than the stories made him sound, maybe only a few years older than me, but his eyes carried something heavier than his age should allow. There was no cruelty in his face. There was something colder than cruelty. Control. One night, I said, give me one night to say goodbye to this house. You do not need to say goodbye, Adrian said. You are not dying. You are simply changing address. That is easy for you to say. It is, he agreed, without apology. But the offer stands until midnight. After that, I stop being generous. I looked at my father one last time. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, folded into that chair like the weight of his choices had finally caught up to his body. I thought about running. I thought about screaming for a neighbor, calling the police, doing anything other than what my body was already deciding to do. But I thought about the house, the only home I had left, and the debt that would swallow it whole the moment I said no. Fine, I said. I will come with you. Adrian did not smile, did not celebrate, did not show any sign that he had won something. He simply nodded once, like a man closing a file. Pack what you need, he said. You have 10 minutes. 10 minutes to decide what mattered enough to bring into a life I had never chosen. I grabbed a bag, some clothes, a photograph of my mother, and nothing else, because nothing else felt like it belonged to the person I was about to become. When I walked back down the stairs, my father was still in the chair, unable to look at me. I did not say goodbye to him. I was not ready to forgive him yet, and I did not know if I ever would be. Adrian was waiting by a black car parked outside, the engine already running, the night air sharp and cold against my skin. He opened the back door without a word. This is not kidnapping, he said, as if he could hear the accusation forming in my mind. This is a transaction. Try to remember the difference. It does not feel different to me, I said, sliding into the seat. It will, he said, closing the door behind me. Or it will not. That depends entirely on you. The car pulled away from the only home I had ever known, and I watched through the window as the small house shrank into the darkness behind us, my father's silhouette still frozen in the doorway, unmoving, unable to stop what he had started years ago. I did not know where we were going. I did not know what rules waited for me at the end of this road. All I knew was that somewhere behind me, a debt had just been paid with my life, and somewhere ahead of me, a man I did not understand was about to decide exactly what that meant. Beside me, Adrian said nothing for a long time. He looked out his own window, jaw tight, as if the silence between us was something he was managing, rather than simply allowing. I wanted to ask him 100 questions. Why my father? Why me? Why now, after 4 years of letting the debt sit untouched? but I kept my mouth closed, because I sensed that the answers, when they came, would only make things worse. The city lights blurred past the window, familiar streets giving way to ones I did not recognize, until even the shape of the buildings started to feel foreign. Somewhere in that changing landscape, I understood that the life I had known was already gone, and whatever waited for me at the end of this drive would be the only life I had left to build. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but because I could not bear to watch the last pieces of my old world disappear behind us. I woke up in a room I did not recognize, and for 3 full seconds, I forgot everything that had happened the night before. Then the memory hit me like cold water. The car, the city lights, the silence beside me on the long drive. I sat up fast, heart pounding, and looked around at walls painted a soft gray, tall windows framed by heavy curtains, and furniture that looked like it cost more than everything I had ever owned combined. This was not a jail cell. It looked more like a hotel suite built for someone important. That thought did not comfort me at all. I got out of bed and tried the door first, half expecting it to be locked. It opened easily, which surprised me more than if it had been sealed shut. A hallway stretched out beyond it, lined with paintings and soft lighting, quiet except for the distant sound of someone moving dishes in a kitchen far below. I found the top of a staircase and looked down into an entrance hall so large it could have swallowed my old house twice over. A woman in a plain gray uniform was crossing the floor with a tray in her hands. She looked up and saw me, and for a moment neither of us moved. "You are awake," she said, setting the tray down on a side table. "Mr. Cross said you would likely sleep past noon after last night." "Where is he?" I asked, my voice rougher than I wanted it to sound. "In his study. He asked to be told when you woke." She studied me for a moment, not unkindly. "My name is Helen. I manage the house. If you need anything, you can ask me." "I need to go home," I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite pity, but close to it. "That is not something I can help with. But breakfast is ready, if you would like to eat before you speak with him." I did not want breakfast. I wanted my old kitchen, my father's nervous chatter, the ordinary noise of a life that made sense. But my stomach ached with hunger I had been too afraid to notice until now. So I followed her down the stairs and sat at a table longer than my entire childhood bedroom, eating food I could not taste. Adrian found me there 20 minutes later. He wore a different coat than the night before, dark gray instead of black, and he looked like he had already been awake for hours, working through problems I could not begin to guess at. "You slept," he said, sitting across from me without asking permission, which I was starting to realize was simply how he moved through the world. Rooms adjusted to him, people adjusted to him. He never seemed to consider the possibility that they might not. "I did not have much choice," I said. "Your men made sure of that." "They gave you space, not sedation," he said. "There is a difference, though I understand you may not care about it this morning." I set down my fork. "What happens now?" "You said I would stay here until the debt is settled. What does that actually mean? What am I supposed to do all day? Wait for you to decide I have paid enough?" He studied me the way he had studied me the night before, like I was a puzzle he had not yet decided was worth solving. "There are rules," he said. "I will explain them once, and I expect you to remember them, because I will not enjoy repeating myself." "How generous," I said, and immediately regretted the sharpness in my voice, though he did not react to it at all. "You do not leave the property without informing Helen or myself," he began. "Not because I am keeping you prisoner, but because there are people in my world who would see you as a way to hurt me, and I will not have that happen because you decided to take an evening walk without telling anyone." That caught me off guard. I had expected rules about obedience, about servitude, about proving my worth. I had not expected a rule rooted in protecting me from something. "You do not answer phones that are not yours," he continued. "You do not open doors for anyone you do not recognize. If a stranger approaches you, you say nothing, and you find me or Helen immediately, and you do not discuss anything you hear in this house with anyone outside it, ever. That is a lot of rules for someone who insists this is not a prison." "Every house has rules, Elena," he said, and the way he used my name still felt strange, too familiar for a man I had known less than a day. "Yours had rules too, curfews, chores, expectations. Mine simply come with higher consequences if broken. And if I break one? He considered the question longer than I expected. Then we will have a conversation about why, and I will decide from there. I am not interested in punishing you for existing in my house, Elena. I am interested in keeping you alive in it. The way he said it made something twist in my chest, some feeling I did not want to examine too closely. I pushed my plate away instead. I want to call my father, I said. Not today, Adrian said. Give it a few days. Let the situation settle. Calling him now will only make you both feel worse, and it will not change anything about your circumstances. That is not your decision to make. Today, it is, he said, standing from the table. Tomorrow, we can discuss it further, if you still want to. He left me sitting there, furious and helpless in equal measure, staring at a plate of food I no longer wanted to eat. The days that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm I did not choose, but slowly began to understand. Helen showed me around the house, room by room, explaining which doors stayed locked and which stayed open, introducing me to a cook named Rosa, who hummed while she worked, and seemed entirely unbothered by the tension that followed me through every hallway. I tried the front gate twice in the first week, both times finding it locked with a code I did not know, both times finding one of Adrian's men appearing within minutes to quietly redirect me back toward the house without ever raising his voice. On the third attempt, I decided to try something different. I waited until Helen was busy in the kitchen and slipped toward the side of the property, where a low wall separated the garden from the street beyond. I was halfway over it when a voice stopped me cold. You are going to hurt yourself doing that. Adrian stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching me with an expression that held more curiosity than anger. I froze, one leg still hooked over the wall, feeling every bit as foolish as I looked. I am leaving, I said, though the words sounded weaker than I wanted them to. To where? He asked. You do not have money. You do not have a phone that works outside this property. The moment you step onto that street, you become a problem for people who are far less patient than I am. People who would very much like to know where you have gone. Is that a threat? It is a fact, he said. I told you the truth the first night. There are men who circle my business the way sharks circle a wounded boat. If they learn you exist, and that you matter to me, even a little, they will use that. Staying inside these walls is not a punishment, Elena. It is the only thing keeping you safe. I climbed down from the wall slowly, my hands shaking, not from fear of him, but from the exhausting realization that he might actually be telling the truth. Why does it matter to you at all? I asked. You could have taken the house instead of me. You could have found another way to collect what my father owes. For a moment, something in his face changed, some wall lowering just slightly before rising again. Debts are rarely only about money, he said. Your father understood exactly what he was signing when he agreed to those terms. I simply held him to them. That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting today, he said, and turned back toward the house, leaving me standing alone in the garden, with more questions than I had arrived with. That night, I could not sleep. I sat by the window of my room, looking out over the dark garden, thinking about my father alone in our small house, wondering if he was eating, wondering if he even could look at himself in a mirror after what he had done. I thought about Adrian too, more than I wanted to admit, replaying the strange flicker of honesty that had crossed his face in the garden before he shut it away again. Around midnight, I heard raised voices from somewhere below. I crept to my door and opened it just enough to listen. Adrian's voice carried up the stairwell, low and hard in a way I had not heard from him before. I do not care what Victor thinks he is owed, he was saying to someone I could not see. That territory was settled 2 years ago. If he wants to test that agreement again, he can explain himself to me directly, instead of sending men to ask questions at my restaurants. Another voice, lower and harder to make out, said something I could not catch. Then make sure it does not happen again, Adrian said, and the finality in his tone made the hair on my arms rise. I will not tell you twice. I closed my door quietly and returned to bed, my mind spinning with a name I had just heard for the first time. Victor, whoever he was. The sound of him in Adrian's mouth carried more weight than any of the rules I had been given, and I understood, lying there in the dark, that the world I had been dropped into was far larger and far more dangerous than a single unpaid debt. The next morning, Adrian was gone before I woke, and Helen told me only that he had business to attend to and would return by evening. I spent the day wandering the house, restless in a way I had not felt since arriving, aware for the first time that the walls around me were not just keeping me in, they were keeping something else out. When Adrian returned that evening, there was a new tightness around his eyes, a tension he tried and failed to hide as he crossed the entrance hall. He paused when he saw me standing at the top of the stairs. "You heard something last night," he said. It was not a question. "I heard a name," I admitted. "Victor." His jaw tightened. "Forget you heard it." "That is not how memory works," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "If I am going to be trapped in the middle of whatever this is, I would rather understand it than stumble through it blind." He looked at me for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, weighing how much truth I could handle against how much silence would keep me safer. Finally, he spoke. "Victor Lane runs the territory east of the river," he said. "We have an agreement that has kept both sides from bleeding money, and worse, for 2 years. Lately, he has been testing the edges of that agreement, and men who test edges eventually push through them entirely. And where do I fit into that?" "You do not," Adrian said, too quickly, and I did not entirely believe him. "You are a debt being repaid, nothing more. Keep it that way, and you will stay far from anything Victor Lane is interested in." I wanted to believe him, but the way his eyes lingered on me a half-second too long before he turned and walked away told me that whatever line he was drawing between us, he was already struggling to keep it in place. That night, for the first time since arriving, I did not try the gate. I did not think about escape at all. Instead, I lay awake thinking about the sound of his voice, defending territory he clearly cared about, and the strange, unwelcome realization that some small part of me had started to care whether he won. In the days that followed, I began paying closer attention to the rhythms of the house, the way Helen moved through her mornings with quiet efficiency, the way Rosa always saved the last piece of bread for whoever looked most tired, the way the guards at the gate rotated shifts without ever seeming to rest. I realized I had been so focused on escaping this world that I had not stopped to actually see it. It was not the chaotic, violent place I had imagined from the whispers back home. It ran on order, on discipline, on rules that everyone followed without needing to be told twice. And at the center of all of it was Adrian, holding the structure together, with a kind of quiet exhaustion I had not noticed until I started looking for it. One afternoon, I found him in the study, a room I had avoided since arriving, because it always seemed to be where the hardest conversations happened. He sat behind a wide desk covered in papers, rubbing his temple with 2 fingers, looking more tired than I had seen him since the night he took me from my home. "You should knock," he said, without looking up. "The door was open," I said. I thought that meant something, in a house full of locked ones. He almost smiled. "Almost. It means I forgot to close it. Do not read too much into an unlocked door, Elena." I stepped further into the room anyway, looking at the papers scattered across his desk, columns of numbers I did not understand, names I did not recognize, some crossed out in heavy black ink. "What is all this?" "Business," he said, which told me nothing and everything at once. "You work very hard for someone people describe as untouchable," I said. He looked up at that, something unreadable in his expression. "Untouchable men still have to hold their territory together, Elena. The moment I stop working, someone like Victor Lane decides the empty space is worth taking. Power is not a thing you win once and keep forever. It is a thing you defend every single day, or you lose it to someone hungrier than you." That sounds exhausting. "It is," he admitted, surprising me with the honesty in his voice. "But it is the only life I know how to live." I wanted to ask him more, about how he had ended up here, about the life before this one, about whether there had ever been a version of him that did not carry the weight of an entire territory on his shoulders. But something in his face told me the door, unlocked or not, was not open that far yet. "I will let you get back to it," I said instead, and turned to leave. "Elena," he said, and I stopped in the doorway. "Thank you for not asking more than I could answer." It was such a small thing to say, but it settled into my chest and stayed there long after I returned to my room. One more piece of a man I was starting to understand I had badly misjudged on the night he walked into my living room and changed everything. 3 weeks into my life inside Adrian's house, I stopped counting the days like a sentence and started noticing them like chapters. It happened slowly, the shift from prisoner to something I did not yet have a name for. Adrian began letting me sit in the outer room during his business meetings, not at the table, but close enough to hear the conversations that shaped his world. He told me it was because he trusted me to stay quiet. I suspected it was because he had grown used to my presence and no longer thought to send me away. That morning, 2 men arrived at the house, dressed in suits that did not quite fit their posture, the kind of men who were used to standing in rooms rather than sitting comfortably in them. Adrian met them in his study, and I positioned myself near the door with a book I had no intention of reading, listening as their voices rose and fell through the thin wood. They were offering him a deal, something about shipping routes along the river, splitting territory that had once belonged entirely to Adrian's family. Their voices were friendly on the surface, but underneath, the friendliness ran something sharper, something that reminded me of the way a snake moves through grass, quiet until it strikes. "The numbers are fair," one of the men was saying. "Victor is simply asking for a partnership, not a takeover." I heard Adrian's chair shift. Victor Lane does not do partnerships. He does slow takeovers dressed up as favors. "You are being paranoid, Adrian." "I am being informed," Adrian said. "There is a difference." The meeting ended a few minutes later, the 2 men leaving with tight smiles that did not reach their eyes. Adrian found me still sitting near the door as they walked past, and though I expected him to send me to my room, he simply gestured for me to follow him back into the study instead. "What did you think of them?" he asked, closing the door behind us. I blinked, surprised he was asking my opinion at all. The taller one kept touching his watch every time he mentioned Victor's name, I said, like he was checking the time, but there was no clock on the wall to compare it to. I think he was nervous about something he was not saying. Adrian's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Go on." "And the shorter one agreed with everything you said, right up until you mentioned Victor being paranoid himself. Then he changed the subject fast. I think Victor sent them to test how much you already know, not to actually offer a partnership." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way he had studied the papers on his desk weeks earlier. "You noticed more in 10 minutes than most of my own men notice in an hour." "I spent years working at a bank," I said. "You learn to read people who are lying about money. It turns out the skill transfers." Something shifted in his expression, respect settling where suspicion had lived before. "Would you be willing to sit in on more of these?" "I thought I was only supposed to be quiet in the corner," I said, though the offer sent an unexpected flicker of excitement through me. "Circumstances change," Adrian said. "Apparently, so do my rules." From that day forward, I became a quiet presence in more of his meetings, watching hands, watching eyes, listening for the small tells that separated a lie from the truth. Adrian began to trust my read on people, and slowly, without either of us naming it directly, I stopped feeling like a captive inside his walls and started feeling like something closer to a partner in a war I had never asked to join. It was during one of those meetings, weeks later, that everything changed again. A man named Nathan Price had been working closely with Adrian for years, one of the few people allowed into the inner circle without question. He sat in on nearly every important conversation, managed shipments along the river, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been doubted. I had liked him from the first time we met, his laugh warm and quick, his manner gentle in a house full of hard edges. That afternoon, Nathan brought news of a shipment delay, blaming it on weather along the coast. Adrian accepted the explanation without much thought, and the meeting moved on to other matters. But I found myself watching Nathan's hands as he spoke, the way they stayed too still, too controlled, unlike the easy gestures I had grown used to seeing from him. After the meeting ended, I found Adrian alone in the study and told him what I had noticed. He was lying, I said. About the weather, his hands did not move once while he explained it, and Nathan always moves his hands when he talks. He rehearsed that explanation before he walked in here. Adrian's expression darkened, but he did not dismiss me the way I half expected. Nathan has been with me for 6 years, Elena. He has no reason to lie about a shipment delay. Maybe not about the delay, I said, but something about the way he explained it felt wrong. I could be mistaken, but I do not think I am. Adrian said nothing for a long moment, staring at the closed door, as if he could see through it, to wherever Nathan had gone. I will look into it, he said finally, quietly. 2 days later, Adrian called me into the study late in the evening, his face carrying an expression I had not seen from him before, something between fury and grief tangled together. He held a folder in his hands, and when he set it down in front of me, I saw photographs, shipping documents, records of payments made to accounts that had nothing to do with Adrian's business. Nathan has been selling information to Victor Lane for the past 4 months, Adrian said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting ever could. Shipment routes, meeting locations, security schedules, everything Victor needed to plan the exact kind of quiet takeover I warned those 2 men about. I am sorry, I said quietly, because I did not know what else to offer. Do not be, Adrian said. You are the reason I found it before it cost me everything I have built. He looked at me then, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. I owe you more than I know how to repay. I did not do it for repayment, I said, and the words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise him. The days after Nathan's betrayal was discovered moved differently through the house, tension replaced by a strange, careful vigilance. Adrian dealt with the situation quietly, and though I never asked for details, and he never offered them, the absence of Nathan's warm laugh from the hallways told me enough about how thoroughly that chapter had closed. It was during this period that Victor Lane finally showed his hand in a way that could no longer be ignored. I was in the garden one afternoon, the first truly warm day of the season, when a black car I did not recognize pulled up outside the gate. Adrian was not home, away at a meeting across the city, and the guards at the entrance moved with a sudden tension that made my stomach twist. I watched from behind a hedge as a man stepped out of the car, tall and broad-shouldered, his suit sharper than anything I had seen even on Adrian's most important visitors. Tell Adrian that Victor sends his regards, the man said to the guard at the gate, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street, and tell him I know exactly who has been keeping him company these past weeks. My blood went cold. I stepped back further behind the hedge, heart pounding, as the man's gaze swept across the front of the property, lingering for a moment too long on the garden where I stood hidden. He did not come any closer. He simply smiled, a slow and confident expression that made my skin crawl, and returned to his car without another word. The engine started, and the vehicle pulled away as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving nothing behind but the echo of his threat hanging in the warm afternoon air. I told Adrian everything the moment he returned home that evening, my voice shaking, despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every detail, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. He knows about you, Adrian said finally, more to himself than to me. I was hoping to keep this contained longer. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means Victor now understands there is a way to hurt me that has nothing to do with shipments or territory, Adrian said, his voice low and hard. It means you are no longer just a debt I am collecting. You are a target. I did not ask to be a target, I said, fear and anger mixing together in my chest. I know, Adrian said, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to helplessness cross his face. I am sorry, Elena. I should have kept you further from all of this. You could not have, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I was already in it the moment you walked into my living room. He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting between us that neither of us had the words to name yet. I will not let anything happen to you, he said quietly, whatever it takes. I believe you, I said, and I realized, standing there in the fading evening light, that I meant it completely. That night, extra guards appeared at the gate, and Adrian moved through the house with a new intensity, making calls late into the evening, arranging security measures I only partially understood. I lay awake listening to the low murmur of his voice through the walls, aware that whatever fragile peace had existed between his world and Victor Lane's had just shattered completely, and aware, too, that I was now standing directly in the center of the wreckage. Somewhere around midnight, unable to sleep, I made my way down to the kitchen for water and found Adrian sitting alone at the long table, a glass of something dark untouched in front of him, staring at nothing. "You should be asleep," he said without looking up. "So should you," I countered, sitting across from him despite the late hour. He looked up then, exhaustion carved deep into his features. "I have spent years building walls around this territory, Elena. Careful, deliberate walls, meant to keep chaos out and order in. And in a matter of weeks, you have found a crack in every single one of them, not because you tried to, but simply by being here." "Is that a complaint?" I asked, unsure whether to feel wounded or something else entirely. "No," he said quietly. "It is an observation. I do not know what to do with it yet." We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that did not need filling, and when I finally returned to my room, I understood that whatever had started as a debt collected under threat had grown into something neither of us had planned for, something dangerous now, not only because of Victor Lane circling closer, but because of the fragile, unspoken thing growing quietly between the two of us in the middle of all that danger. The next few days passed under a new kind of watchfulness. Helen began locking doors that had always stood open, and Rosa stopped humming while she cooked, her attention instead fixed on the windows every time a car passed on the street outside. I noticed the small changes the way I had learned to notice everything in that house, the tightening of routines, the extra guard stationed near the garden wall where Victor's man had lingered his gaze on me. Adrian called a meeting of his closest men one evening, and this time, instead of sitting quietly near the door, he asked me to sit at the table itself. I felt the weight of every eye in the room when I took the seat beside him, some curious, some openly skeptical of why a debt being repaid was suddenly being treated like someone worth consulting. "Victor is escalating faster than expected," Adrian said, spreading a map of the city across the table. "He tested our patience with Nathan. Now he is testing it by threatening what is inside these walls. That tells me he believes he already has the upper hand." "Does he?" one of the men asked bluntly. "No," Adrian said, with a certainty that steadied the room. "But he believes it, and a man who believes he is winning takes risks. A cautious man would not. That gives us an opening." I studied the map in front of us, the marked locations of warehouses and routes I had heard mentioned in passing over the past weeks. What if the shipment delay Nathan lied about was not just cover for selling information? I asked, the thought forming even as I spoke it aloud. What if it was also meant to test whether you would move a backup shipment through the eastern route? If Victor already knows that route from Nathan, and you use it now to recover, you would be walking directly into whatever he has planned. The room went quiet. Adrian looked at the map, then at me, something calculating and impressed moving behind his eyes. "She is right," he said slowly. "The eastern route is compromised. We reroute everything through the north dock instead, effective tonight." The men around the table exchanged glances, some clearly reconsidering their skepticism about my presence, and for the first time since arriving in that house, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not fear, not helplessness, but purpose. I was no longer simply surviving inside Adrian's world. I was beginning to shape it. After the meeting ended, and the room emptied, Adrian remained at the table, staring at the map long after everyone else had gone. I lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to leave him to his thoughts or stay. "You keep surprising me," he said, without looking up. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "It is simply not something I am used to. Most people in my life either fear me too much to speak honestly, or want something from me too badly to bother telling me the truth. You do neither." "Maybe I want something too," I said quietly. "I just have not decided what yet." He studied me for a long moment, something unspoken passing between us in the dim light of the study, before he finally looked back down at the map, folding it carefully, as though he needed something to do with his hands. "Get some rest, Elena," he said. "Tomorrow we find out if Victor Lane is as patient as he pretends to be." I left him there, alone with his maps and his calculations, carrying with me the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being trusted by a man who trusted almost no one at all. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in the dark, replaying the meeting, the way the room had gone silent when I spoke, the way Adrian's eyes had found mine before he agreed to change the route. It should have frightened me, how deeply I had already woven myself into the fabric of his world. A few weeks ago, I had been counting coins at a bank, planning nothing more dangerous than which bus to catch home. Now I was reading liars across a table and reshaping shipment routes with men who carried the kind of quiet violence in their eyes that most people spent their whole lives never encountering. And yet, lying there in the dark, I did not feel afraid of who I was becoming. I felt afraid, instead, of how much I wanted to stay. Somewhere near dawn, I finally drifted into a thin, uneasy sleep, and in it, I dreamed of my father, alone in our small house, unaware that the daughter he had traded away was no longer simply surviving her sentence. She was learning to fight inside it, one careful observation at a time, and somewhere in the tangled center of fear and purpose, she was beginning to wonder if the cage she had been placed in might, in its own strange way, be teaching her how to finally stand on her own. My father's voice on the phone was the last thing I expected to hear that morning, and the fear in it told me something had already gone terribly wrong. "Elena, you need to listen to me," Gerald said, his words rushed and shaking. "I made a mistake. I tried to fix things on my own, and I think I made everything so much worse." I gripped the phone tighter, my heart pounding. "What did you do?" "A man came to see me last week," my father said. "He said his name was Victor. He said if I helped him, he could make sure the rest of the debt disappeared completely, that you could come home, that everything could go back to how it was before." My stomach dropped. "Please tell me you did not agree to anything." The silence on the other end of the line answered before he did. "I gave him information," my father said, his voice breaking. "Small things. Where the house is located. How many guards I saw the night they took you. I did not think it would matter, Elena. I swear I did not know what he was planning to do with it." I sank onto the edge of my bed, the phone shaking in my hand. "Dad, he is not trying to help me. He is trying to hurt Adrian, and you just handed him exactly what he needed." "I was trying to bring you home," my father said, and the desperation in his voice nearly broke something in me. I did not know how else to fix what I started. I did not have time to comfort him. I ended the call and ran down the stairs to find Adrian, my mind spinning through everything my father had just confessed. I found him in the study, already reading something on his phone with an expression I had never seen before, cold and utterly still. "You need to hear this," I said, breathless. "My father spoke with Victor. He gave him details about this house, about the guards, about where I am." Adrian looked up slowly, and for a moment I could not read anything in his face at all. "I know," he said. "I just received word that Victor's men were spotted near the north perimeter 20 minutes ago." The room seemed to tilt beneath me. "This is my fault," I said. "If my father had not tried to fix things his own way, none of this would be happening." "This is not your fault," Adrian said, standing quickly and moving toward the window, scanning the garden below with narrowed eyes. "Your father made a choice out of fear and love, in equal measure. It is a mistake, I understand, even if I cannot forgive it easily." "What happens now?" "Now we move faster than Victor expects," Adrian said, already reaching for the radio on his desk, issuing quiet, sharp instructions to the guards stationed around the property. "He believes he has the advantage of surprise. He does not know that surprise stopped working the moment your father told me everything you just told me." I blinked. "My father called you?" "No," Adrian said. "But I have men watching his house too, Elena, for exactly this reason. I heard the conversation the moment it happened, before Victor's men even left his front porch." Something in me softened, despite the danger pressing in on every side. He had been protecting my father this whole time, quietly, without ever mentioning it, likely because he knew I would have questions he was not ready to answer. "Stay near Helen," Adrian said, moving toward the door, his voice hard and focused now, all traces of the softer man from the kitchen conversation gone, replaced by someone built entirely for this moment. "Do not go near the windows. Do not go outside for any reason, no matter what you hear." "Adrian," I said, catching his arm before he could leave, "please be careful." He paused, looking down at my hand on his arm, something flickering behind his eyes that he did not have time to examine. "I will be," he said quietly. "I have too much left to protect to be careless now." He left the room, and I stood there for a long moment, fear and helplessness pressing in from every direction, before Helen appeared at the doorway and guided me toward the interior of the house, away from any window that might offer a clear line of sight from the street. The next hour passed in a haze of tense waiting. I sat with Helen, in a small room near the kitchen, listening to muffled voices and distant footsteps moving through the house, unable to see anything, unable to do anything, but wait and hope that the man who had turned my life upside down would walk back through that door in one piece. Around midday, the sound of raised voices reached us from the entrance hall, and Helen's hand tightened around mine. I strained to listen, catching fragments of an argument, a voice I did not recognize demanding to see Adrian, another voice, sharper and more familiar, refusing entry without explanation. "Stay here," Helen said, rising to check the hallway. I could not stay still. I followed a few steps behind her, peering around the corner into the entrance hall, and my blood ran cold at what I saw. Two of Victor's men stood near the front door, having somehow talked their way past the outer gate, facing off against three of Adrian's guards in a standoff that felt one wrong word away from violence. "We only want to deliver a message," one of Victor's men said, his tone deceptively calm. "Victor wants Adrian to know that patience has limits, and that certain guests staying in this house might be more valuable to negotiations than anyone realizes." My heart pounded as I realized they were talking about me. Adrian appeared from the study then, his expression carved from stone, and the entire room seemed to still around him. "You have delivered your message," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that carried more threat than any shout could have. "Now you can leave the same way you came in, or my men can explain the consequences of overstaying an unwelcome visit." The two men exchanged a glance, some unspoken calculation passing between them, before the one who had spoken smiled thinly and inclined his head. "Victor will be in touch," he said, and the two of them turned and left without another word, disappearing back through the gate they should never have been able to breach. The moment the door closed behind them, the tension in the room did not ease. If anything, it sharpened. "How did they get past the gate?" Adrian demanded, turning to his guards with fury barely contained beneath his voice. "They had a code, sir," one of the men said, visibly shaken. "One of the older access codes. It should have been deactivated weeks ago." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Deactivate every code issued before Nathan's removal. All of them. Now." The guards scattered to follow the order, and Adrian turned to find me standing at the edge of the hallway, having witnessed everything. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, stopping close enough that I could see the barely restrained fear behind his controlled expression. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to steady it. "But they were talking about me. Victor knows exactly what I mean to you." "I am aware," Adrian said grimly, "and that means we no longer have the luxury of waiting for him to make the next move." "What does that mean?" "It means I end this before he gets another chance to walk through that door," Adrian said, and the certainty in his voice was both terrifying and, in some strange way, deeply reassuring. That evening, Adrian gathered his closest men once more, and this time there was no pretense of debate. He laid out a plan with sharp, decisive precision, drawing on weeks of information I had helped uncover, mapping Victor's movements, his weaknesses, the cracks in his own organization that had started to show since his failed attempt to intimidate us at the gate. I sat at the table again, watching him work, struck by how different he seemed now than the calm, controlled man who had walked into my living room weeks earlier. That man had been cold and composed. This man was focused and lethal, every word calculated, every decision weighed against the safety of the people in this house, myself included. Later that night, after the meeting ended and the house finally settled into an uneasy quiet, I found Adrian standing alone in the garden, staring up at a sky heavy with clouds. "You should be resting," I said, echoing the words he had once said to me. "I could say the same to you," he replied, without turning. I moved to stand beside him, the cool night air settling around us. "My father almost got you killed today," I said quietly. "I do not know how to apologize for that." You do not need to, Adrian said. Your father is not the one who chose this life for you. I am. If anyone owes an apology tonight, it is me, for dragging you into a war that was never yours to fight. I stopped feeling dragged into it weeks ago, I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Somewhere along the way, it became mine too. He turned to look at me then, something raw and unguarded crossing his face in the dim light. Elena, whatever happens next, I need you to know that none of this began the way it started. You stopped being a debt to me a long time ago. My breath caught. Then what am I to you now? He did not answer with words. He simply reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle, in a way that contradicted every hard edge I had come to associate with him. And for a moment, standing there in the quiet garden, with danger circling closer with every passing hour, none of it mattered as much as the space between us finally closing. Tomorrow, he said softly, stepping back before either of us could take that moment any further. We finish what Victor started. Tonight, just stay here with me a little longer. And so I did, standing beside him beneath the heavy clouds, both of us bracing for whatever storm was about to break, neither of us willing to let go of the fragile peace we had found in the middle of it. Later, after Adrian had gone back inside to finalize the last details of his plan, I lingered in the garden alone, replaying the moment his hand had touched my face, trying to make sense of everything that had shifted between us in the span of a single terrifying day. A few weeks ago, I would have laughed at anyone who suggested I could feel anything but resentment toward the man who took me from my home. Now I stood in his garden, worried more about his safety than my own, unable to untangle fear for myself from fear for him. My phone buzzed against my hip, and I saw my father's name on the screen again. I hesitated before answering, still raw from our earlier conversation, but the guilt in his voice when he spoke told me he had been sitting with his mistake all day, turning it over and over without relief. Elena, he said quietly, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there anything I can do? Anything to help fix what I broke? You can stay away from Victor Lane, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. You can let Adrian handle this, the way he knows how, without trying to fix it yourself again. I only wanted you home, my father said, his voice cracking. I never meant for any of this to put you in more danger. I know, I said, softening despite myself. But Dad, I need you to trust me on this. I am safer here, inside these walls, than I would be anywhere Victor Lane could reach me easily. Please, just wait. Let this play out. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. I am sorry, Elena, for all of it. For the debt, for the mistake, for putting you in the middle of something I never should have let get this far. I know, I said again, and for the first time since the night Adrian walked into our living room, I felt something loosen in my chest, some small piece of the anger I had been carrying toward my father, finally beginning to ease. We will talk properly when this is over, I promise. I ended the call and stood alone in the darkening garden a while longer, watching the lights of the house glow warm against the gathering clouds, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of hope pushing quietly against the fear that had defined so much of the past several weeks. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever Victor Lane had planned, I was no longer the frightened woman who had climbed into a stranger's car with nothing but a photograph and a change of clothes. I had learned this world, learned its rules, learned the man who ruled it, and for the first time, I intended to stand inside the coming storm instead of hiding from it. The morning Victor Lane made his final move, I woke to the sound of engines outside the gate, more than I had ever heard at once, and I knew before Helen burst through my door that the waiting was finally over. Adrian wants you in the safe room, Helen said, breathless, already pulling me toward the hallway. Now, Elena, there is no time. What is happening? I asked, though some part of me already understood. Victor's men are at the gate, she said, more than we expected. Adrian is trying to hold them at the perimeter, but he needs to know you are secure before he can focus on anything else. I let her guide me down a hidden staircase behind a bookshelf in the study, into a reinforced room I had not even known existed until that moment, hidden beneath the house like a secret Adrian had hoped he would never need to use. The door sealed behind Helen with a heavy, final sound, and through a narrow monitor screen mounted on the wall, I could see grainy footage of the front gate. guards moving into position, and beyond them, a line of cars I did not recognize. I watched, my heart pounding, as the first shots rang out somewhere beyond the camera's reach, the sound muffled but unmistakable even through the thick walls of the safe room. Helen gripped my hand tightly, her own composure cracking for the first time since I had known her. "He will be all right," she said, though I was not sure if she was reassuring me or herself. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. On the monitor, I watched shapes move across the garden in chaotic bursts, unable to tell which figures belonged to Adrian's men and which belonged to Victor's. My chest ached with a fear sharper than anything I had felt the night Adrian first walked into my living room, because this time, the danger was not aimed at taking me away from my old life. It was aimed at taking away the new one I had only just begun to want. Then, on the screen, I saw him. Adrian moved through the garden with a controlled, deadly precision, directing his men with sharp gestures, taking cover behind the low wall I had once tried to climb over in my first desperate week in his house. My breath caught as one of Victor's men rounded the corner toward his position, and for a single terrifying moment, I thought I was about to watch everything I had come to care about disappear on a grainy black and white screen. Adrian moved first. Whatever happened in that brief exchange was too fast and too far from the camera for me to fully understand, but the man who had rounded the corner did not get back up, and Adrian pressed forward without hesitation, disappearing from the edge of the frame. "I cannot just sit here," I said, pulling my hand free from Helen's grip. "Elena, you promised him you would stay safe," Helen said, alarm sharpening her voice. "I promised him I would stay inside these walls," I said, my mind racing. "But I know this house better than most of Victor's men do now. I know where the old side passage leads, the one near the kitchen pantry that connects to the garden without passing the main gate. If I can reach the north side, I can warn Adrian's men about the weak point in the wall Victor's people used to access this property before, the one his guards flagged weeks ago but never fully repaired." "That is too dangerous," Helen said. "Staying here and doing nothing is more dangerous," I said, already moving toward the door, "for all of us." I did not wait for her permission. I slipped through the hidden passage, my heart hammering against my ribs, moving through the shadowed hallway toward the kitchen, praying I would not run into anyone before I reached the guards stationed near the north perimeter. The kitchen was empty, chairs overturned in the rush of the guards responding to the attack. I pushed through the side door into the garden, staying low, moving along the hedges the way I had learned to during my early, frustrated attempts at escape, grateful now for every failed effort that had taught me the layout of this place so thoroughly. I found two of Adrian's guards crouched near the north wall, weapons raised toward the darkness beyond it. "The old service gate," I said, breathless, dropping down beside them. "It has a gap in the fence line behind the storage shed, from when Victor's men breached it before. If they know about it, they will try to flank you from there." The guards exchanged a sharp look before one of them spoke urgently into his radio, redirecting a portion of Adrian's men toward the gap I had described. Moments later, gunfire erupted from that exact direction, and I watched, breath held, as Adrian's men repelled an attempted breach that would have caught them entirely by surprise without the warning. "Get back inside," one of the guards said to me, urgency edging his voice. "This is not safe." I nodded, beginning to retreat toward the house, when a shape moved in the shadows near the hedge line ahead of me. Too close, too sudden. I froze, as a man stepped into view, not one of Adrian's guards, his eyes locking onto me with a recognition that made my blood run cold. "There you are," he said, and I recognized the voice instantly. The man who had come to the gate weeks earlier, delivering Victor's message with a slow, confident smile. Before I could scream, before I could run, he lunged toward me, and I did the only thing my body could think to do. I grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a heavy garden tool leaning against the shed, and swung it with every bit of strength fear could summon. It connected hard enough to send him stumbling backward, giving me the half-second I needed to run, screaming for the guards behind me. They reached the man before he could recover fully, subduing him quickly, while I stood shaking against the wall of the shed, my hands still gripping the garden tool, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Adrian found me there minutes later, appearing through the chaos with blood on his sleeve that was not his own, his eyes wild with fear, until they landed on me, and something in his face broke open with relief. "Elena," he said, closing the distance between us in 3 quick strides, pulling me into arms that shook nearly as much as mine. "You were supposed to stay in the safe room." "I could not just wait," I said, my voice trembling. "I knew about the gap in the north wall. I had to warn them." He pulled back just enough to look at me, disbelief, and something fiercer than relief warring across his face. "You may have just saved every one of my men out there." "Is it over?" I asked. "Is Victor's attack over?" "Not yet," Adrian said, his jaw tightening as he glanced back toward the front of the property, where the sound of gunfire had finally begun to fade into a tense, uncertain silence. "But it is close." The final confrontation, when it came, happened not with more gunfire, but with a car pulling slowly through the shattered front gate, moving with a deliberate calm that felt more threatening than the chaos that had come before it. Victor Lane stepped out himself this time, his earlier confidence noticeably thinner, flanked by only 2 men where he had once commanded dozens. "You have cost me a great deal today, Adrian," Victor said, his voice carrying across the ruined garden. "You cost yourself the moment you decided my territory was yours to take," Adrian replied, stepping forward to meet him, his own men fanning out silently behind him, weapons lowered but ready. "You are down to 2 men, Victor. I still have a dozen standing behind me. This ends here, one way or another." Victor's eyes flicked toward me, standing partially hidden behind Adrian's shoulder, and something calculating moved behind his gaze. "The girl seems to matter quite a lot to you," he said. "Perhaps there is still a deal to be made." "There is no deal," Adrian said, his voice carrying a finality that silenced even the wind moving through the broken garden. "You brought this war to my door. You will leave it the same way you came, with nothing, or you will not leave it at all. The choice is yours, but I promise you, it is the last one you will make, regarding anything that belongs to me." The standoff stretched for a long, breathless moment, Victor weighing his rapidly disappearing options against a man who had clearly already won. Finally, something in Victor's posture deflated, the confidence draining out of him as he understood the position he had put himself in. "This is not finished," Victor said, though the words carried none of the weight they might have held an hour earlier. "It is for you," Adrian said. "Leave, and do not come back. If I see your face near this territory again, I will not offer you the courtesy of a conversation." Victor retreated to his car without another word, his remaining men following close behind, and the vehicle pulled away through the broken gate, disappearing down the street that had, only an hour earlier, been filled with the sound of an attack meant to end everything Adrian had built. The garden fell into an exhausted, disbelieving quiet. Adrian turned to me immediately, his hands framing my face as he studied me for any sign of injury, his composure finally cracking under the weight of everything that had happened. "You are safe," he said, more to himself than to me, relief breaking through every hard edge he usually kept so carefully in place. "You are actually safe." "So are you," I said, my own voice shaking as the adrenaline of the past hour finally began to fade, leaving only exhaustion and a fragile, overwhelming relief in its place. In the days that followed, the house slowly returned to something resembling normal, though nothing about my life inside it felt the same as before. Adrian dealt with the aftermath of Victor's failed attack methodically, securing his territory, repairing the damage to the gate and the garden, ensuring that the fractures Nathan's betrayal had created were fully sealed shut. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the attack, Adrian called me into the study, a familiar folder resting on his desk. My chest tightened at the sight of it, memories of that first terrible night rushing back before he spoke. "Your father's debt," Adrian said, sliding the folder across the desk toward me. "Settled in full." I opened it with trembling hands, finding pages marked paid in full, signatures confirming that the weight my father had carried for years, the weight that had brought me into this house in the first place, no longer existed. "I do not understand," I said. "I thought the debt was only settled once you decided it was." "I decided weeks ago," Adrian said quietly. "The night you warned my men about the north wall. Every day since then, Elena, you have not been repaying anything. You have simply been choosing to stay." I looked up at him, my throat tight with emotions I could not fully name. "Then why did you not tell me sooner?" Because I was afraid that once you knew you were free to leave, you would, Adrian admitted, the honesty costing him something visible in the tightness of his jaw. And I did not know how to face this house, this life, without you in it anymore. I closed the folder slowly, setting it aside, and crossed the small distance between us, until I stood directly in front of him. I am not going anywhere, I said, not because of a debt, and not because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because somewhere along the way, this stopped being your house I was trapped in, and became a life I actually want. Adrian reached out, his hand finding mine with a gentleness that still surprised me every time, despite everything I now knew about the strength hidden beneath it. Then stay, he said simply, not as a debt, not as an obligation, just because you choose to. I choose to, I said, and meant it more completely than I had meant anything in my entire life. Outside the study window, the garden that had nearly become a battlefield now stood quiet and repaired, the first flowers of the season pushing up through soil that had weeks earlier been churned by chaos and fear. I thought about the frightened woman who had climbed into a stranger's car with nothing but a photograph of her mother and a bag of clothes, and I realized, standing there with my hand in Adrian's, that she had walked through fire and found something on the other side worth staying for. The debt was gone. The danger, for now, had passed, and for the first time since a smug mafia boss had declared that I belonged to him, I understood that I belonged only to myself, and that I had chosen, freely and completely, to build a life beside him instead of beneath him. It was not the ending I had ever imagined for myself. But standing in that quiet garden, watching the sun break through clouds that had threatened storms for weeks, I understood it was exactly the ending I wanted. A few days later, I finally went to see my father, Adrian insisting on driving me himself, despite my reassurance that the danger had passed. The small house looked exactly as I remembered it, worn but familiar, and my father stood in the doorway looking older than the last time I had seen him, the guilt of the past weeks etched deeply into his face. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking as he pulled me into a careful embrace. "I did not think you would want to see me after everything. You made mistakes," I said, stepping back to look at him properly. "Big ones, but you are still my father, and I still love you, even when I am angry with you." He glanced past me toward Adrian, who stood a respectful distance away near the car, and something like understanding passed across his face. "He settled the debt," my father said, "fully. I received the confirmation this morning. I do not know how to thank a man I once feared more than anything." "You do not need to thank him," I said. "You need to rebuild your own life, carefully this time, without shortcuts, and without desperate deals with dangerous men." "I will," he said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed him completely. We spent the afternoon together, my father asking careful questions about the life I now led, listening without judgment as I described the world I had been thrown into, and had slowly, unexpectedly, learned to call my own. When it was time to leave, he walked me to the car, pausing before I climbed inside. "He looks at you differently than I expected," my father said quietly, glancing toward Adrian, "like something precious he almost lost." "He did almost lose me," I said, "several times, but we found our way through it together." My father nodded slowly, something like peace settling into his tired features. "Take care of each other," he said. "That is all I can ask for now." The drive back to Adrian's house passed in comfortable silence, the city lights beginning to glow gold against the darkening sky. Adrian reached over at one point, his hand finding mine on the seat between us, and I laced my fingers through his without hesitation, the gesture feeling as natural as breathing after everything we had survived together. "Regretting your choice yet?" he asked, a rare, easy smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Not even a little," I said, and meant every word. That evening, standing together on the balcony overlooking the repaired garden below, Adrian wrapped an arm around me as the last light of the day faded into a soft, peaceful dusk. The house that had once felt like a cage now felt like something else entirely, a place built not on debt or obligation, but on choices freely made and dangers faced side by side. "Whatever comes next," Adrian said quietly, "territory disputes, old enemies, new threats we cannot yet predict, I want you beside me for all of it." Not because you owe me anything, because I do not know how to imagine any version of this life without you in it. Then you will not have to imagine it, I said, leaning into him as the stars began to appear overhead. Because I am not planning on going anywhere. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, and we stood there together in the quiet evening, two people who had begun as captor and collateral, and had found, against every unlikely odd, something honest and enduring in the space between fear and trust. The debt that had once defined everything between us was gone, settled and forgotten, replaced by something neither money nor threats could ever purchase. A choice, made freely, to stay.